Welcome to the National Park Service webinar on the African American Civil Rights Grant Program and how to do a great grant application. The African American Civil Rights Program is funded through the Historic Preservation Fund. This fund has funding allocated to it from offshore oil lease revenue, the idea being that endangering one resource should be putting back into preserving another resource. So this funding does not come from tax dollars. It comes from a kind of a special place. Within the Park Service, the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division manages all the funding for the Historic Preservation Fund and thus the African American Civil Rights Program. Today we're going to talk about how to do a successful grant application, some pointers and advice, and hopefully this will help you be successful. The African American Civil Rights Program documents, interprets, and preserves sites and stories related to the African American struggle to gain equal rights as citizens in the 20th century. That is an important factor to this program. It's very specific in the guiding language, in the statutory language, that all grants need to focus on sites and stories from the 20th century. This may involve resources and buildings that are older than the 20th century, but the significance with the civil rights era needs to be tied to that time period. So please be aware of that. The foundation document for this program is the Park Service's 2008 report, Civil Rights in America, a Framework for Identifying Significant Sites. And you can download a PDF of that report from the link in this webinar. This is the document that we use for determining if grant applications are eligible and appropriate to the purpose of the program. Do keep in mind that there is no matching requirement for this grant program. So that is a unique aspect to this program, unlike some other Historic Preservation Fund grants. What is the process? All applications must be made through grants.gov. Paper or email applications will not be accepted. Because of that, we encourage you to start early. Registration in these programs can take some time. So please note that in order to register in grants.gov, you must be registered in SAMS.gov. Both registrations for those is a free process. You should not have to pay anyone. There are some businesses out there that offer to assist you if you pay them, but that should not be necessary. It can take up to 4 weeks to register in sam.gov, so please plan accordingly. We will not grant extensions to the deadline due to incomplete registrations in these systems. So that is a very important part of understanding, is how to apply for one of these grants. Typically, the opportunity to apply for these grants, the applications are posted on grants.gov in the summer and due in the fall, usually around October. If there's any changes to those dates, you'll be able to find those on our website, and I'll provide you that information at the end of the webinar. To keep informed, you can sign up for the opportunity and save that as a search so you can keep up with when these grant applications will be available. Who can apply? States, tribes, local governments, and nonprofits. If you are not one of these entities, you could partner with one of these groups to apply. However, they would need to be the grant applicant. Keep in mind that for physical preservation projects, all structures must be listed in or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is an important eligibility criteria if you're doing a preservation project. What do we pay for? These grants fit into two categories, history and preservation. History grants fund planning, research, survey, inventory, documentation, interpretation, education, and preservation planning. This is a wide range of activities, so I would encourage you to look on our website at what we have funded with this program in the past to see if your project fits in. If you have a question, if your project is eligible, please email or call us and ask. We're happy to assist you with that. We do some education and exhibit planning as part of this, but keep in mind that all history grants still need to be tied to a place. So it needs to be a place where an event happened. It needs to be a site that was significant for association with an individual or the planning of an event or something like that, all that ties back to the civil rights movement in the 20th century. The second category are preservation grants. These are a little more straightforward. They fund architectural services and physical repair and rehabilitation to sites and structures. Any grants, any projects funded with this preservation side of the program, those projects will have to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for archaeology and historic preservation. So you're going to want to take a look at those standards. You're going to want to look specifically at the treatment standards for historic properties, and most likely under that, the rehabilitation standards. That's kind of the bar that we will hold all these projects to. So being familiar with those and not proposing work that would not meet those standards is a good idea when you're working on these applications. For preservation projects, the minimum request is $75,000 and the maximum is $500,000 or $500,000. For history, the minimum request is $15,000 and the maximum is $50,000. Remember, there is no match required for this program, but it can be considered as a competitive factor. What do we not pay for? Sometimes that's easier to define. We don't construct new buildings. We don't acquire collections or historic properties. We don't do conservation of collections, except maybe as part of gathering oral history documentation. I would encourage you to look to NEA, NEH, and IMLS for funding for conservation of collections. Long-term maintenance of the building or of the collection beyond the grant program is not something we can fund. We don't reconstruct historic properties, and often the building where the event happened may be gone, but we cannot rebuild that. We focus on preserving what is still in existence. We don't move historic properties, nor do we do work to properties that have been moved and thus are no longer eligible for listing in the National Register. If you're dealing with a moved property, please contact your state historic preservation office and talk to them to determine if the property is still eligible for the National Register. That is key. We don't fund cash reserves, endowments, revolving funds, or fundraising. We cannot pay for work that took place prior to the announcement of the award. We have to approve everything that's going to happen with the award. So it's all going to happen after the grants are awarded. And please note that at its discretion, the panel may award less than the minimum grant request, or they may make some budget recommendations if they see something in your application that's not eligible, or there may not be enough funding to fund the entire project. Evaluation and selection criteria. So this is really the meat of your application. This is the project description, and this is where you're going to tell us what you are planning to do. Very important first criteria is significance. You're going to want to make the tie that your project has to the civil rights movement in the 20th century. Tell us the significance of the story. Tell us if your site has already been designated at the national, state, tribal, or local level. You don't need to repeat all the information that is in that nomination, but giving us a quick summary of it is important. Tell us about the integrity of the resource. Talk to us about how your project is either going to tell a story and embellish a story that we already know, or maybe it's going to define an untold story, identify a place that we don't know about that's significant to the civil rights history. If you're doing a preservation project, we need to know that the State Historic Preservation Office concurs that your site is eligible for the National Register if it is not already listed in the National Register. That should come in the form of a determination of eligibility, perhaps a form from the state office or a letter from the state office, or that you can document that the site was included in a survey that the state worked with and approved, and that determined the site eligible. So make sure you include that documentation with your application as an attachment. Criteria is the need, urgency, and threat. This is a little more straightforward, but you need to tell us why is it important that you get this grant right now. Often some of this can be demonstrated in your photographs, especially if you're dealing with a physical site. Show us the hole in the roof, show us the water pouring in, show us those types of things. Demonstrate to us the threat of not doing these oral histories right now, that the important figures maybe, you know, it's the end of their lifetime and they need to tell these stories. And tell us how this is, you know, the activities that you're doing are going to mitigate that threat or need. Feasibility is the next criteria. And this is where you really demonstrate to us that as an organization, you are ready to handle a federal grant. You need to talk about the budget justification in a separate document. I would encourage you to make sure what you're asking for in your budget matches what you asked for in your application. Sometimes those become different and cause questions amongst the panel. Talk about your timeline. We will always start you off with 2 years. Most projects run at least 2 to 3 years. So tell us how you're going to get this work done in that time frame. Tell us about the resources that you have. Do you have experience managing grants? Are you going to hire financial assistance? Are you going to hire preservation assistance? Do you have that expertise already? And then tell us how you're going to meet those federal requirements and guidelines. This is a very important part of the application so that the panel has confidence that the grant will be successful after it is awarded. The next is sustainability. So describe the impacts after the project is completed. So if we put this federal investment into this project, what is going to happen afterwards? Does it just sit on a shelf, or does it have continuing impact for the community? Talk about public-private partnerships that are going to help you make this project successful, and community engagement. Very important to know that the investment we're doing is going to continue. And finally, the Secretary of Interior has departmental priorities. It's kind of our strategic plan for our department. And we need you to talk about how your project is going to help us advance those. So the 2 priorities that are most closely tied to this program are modernizing our infrastructure and restoring trust with local communities. If you're doing a preservation project, you are likely doing both of these priorities. If you're doing a history project, you may be not so much modernizing infrastructure as restoring trust, and that's okay. So just either talk about one or both as they apply to your project. And I would encourage you, as you're working on these criteria, to keep them balanced. So don't spend so much time on the first question that your last question is a little bit weaker. So do keep in mind they're all asking different questions, and we need different and strong answers to them all. So what happens after you submit your application? The Park Service personnel will go through an eligibility screening, make sure your property is eligible for the National Register, make sure what you're asking for is eligible for the program. And then that personnel will look through the applications along with qualified federal employees that make up the 2 review panels. There is a review panel for the history projects and a review panel for the preservation projects. Keep in mind that those matching funds are not required but can be considered as part of the evaluation process. And it might not be matching funding. It could be in-kind donations, your personnel and your staff donation, time, that type of thing as well. Reviewers' applications are based solely on the material provided in the application. So additional materials that come later, like letters of support that are not part of the application, will not be considered. I would encourage you to spend your time writing your application more than gathering letters of support. Where we want to see a letter of support is if there is an entity or a partner that is specifically involved in the project, they're contributing to the project and telling us what that contribution will be. Once the panel has made funding recommendations, those will move to the Secretary of the Interior for final approval and announcement. The Park Service will apply risk assessments to both the financial and the programmatic side of those projects recommended for funding. So this may include some additional reporting requirements depending on your ability to meet that risk. And a summary of the panel comments are always available to applicants if you're funded or if you're not funded at the end of the grant process. And I strongly encourage you to seek out those comments to help you improve your next application. Oftentimes, applicants apply more than once, and it's important to consider these comments as part of your next application. Often we get a lot of questions about grant programs, so we've tried to compile a list of those frequently asked questions to help you here. Is there a local resource for our organization to contact? We strongly encourage that you talk with your state historic preservation office before applying, and please do that early in the process. We've mentioned them several times throughout this presentation, and it's important that at least they understand that you're applying, because they will be involved in the project later through the Section 106 review process. Could you use our funds to upgrade for ADA? Yes, this is definitely an eligible cost. It's usually more competitive as part of a larger preservation project. May you use our funds for preservation of archival materials? This is not what this program is intended to fund. So I encourage you to kind of look around for other grant opportunities that might help with that. Our organization would like to submit 2 applications at one time. Can we? Sure, you can. You will be competing against yourself, however, so keep that in mind. And usually we see an organization submit an application in each category rather than 2 in one category. Can you apply for a history and a preservation grant? Under one application, no. These are separate grant opportunities on grants.gov. They need to be applied for as separate projects. Can you apply for a second grant for the same project? Yes, we have had repeat applicants. This program can fund phased projects, especially when you're dealing with construction. But be clear to outline that your application shows the success you have made with the previous grant. If you're not successfully managing the first grant, the odds of getting a second grant are not high. Here's the additional information resource at our website. So go.mps.gov/civil rights grant, no spaces. We encourage you to call us with any questions or email. This is our main email at preservation_grants_info@mps.gov, and our main phone number. We do not have a live human answering the phone, but we do return your calls within 24 to 48 hours. And then if you have questions about grants.gov, we strongly encourage you to call them, not us. We are not experts in grants.gov, and they do have a very helpful 24-hour helpline, as well as respond to their emails. So I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan Brown, and I'm Chief of the State Tribal Local Plans and Grants Division at the Park Service, and we look forward to seeing your application. And please do let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.